Chapter 11. The Perils of Freedom. With Dee having stayed out all night, I awoke the next morning to find that Mum had gone to work and taken my new cardigan with her. I'd later learned that Dee had stayed out the previous night with a new friend she'd made by the name of Hillary. However, this Hillary was not a female, but a 19-year-old Maltese lad from a town approximately 10 miles to the south of St. Paul's Bay. While both Dee and I became good friends with Hillary, it was his infatuation with her that motivated him to venture north to Bourguiba on a nightly basis. On many an evening, either one or both of us would jump in Hillary's immaculate white Volkswagen Beetle and go joyriding around the island. Yet this was no ordinary joyride, as Hillary had installed the kind of sound system that would shake the car and the occupants within to the core. With my ears ringing, I'd bounce out of the car and into whichever bar we stopped at for a drink. Fancying ourselves so cool, we rode around the island with the windows down, music blaring and posing with a freshly lit ciggy. After dropping us off, Hillary would often call into the complex to catch up with longtime friend David, the night receptionist, before heading home. While Dee's lack of reciprocation would lead to and eventual souring in relations with Hillary, for now, she and I enjoyed the time we spent in his company. As to Manuel, the man whose tight cream trousers had so titillated my mother, he had a type he went for, and it was certainly not her. Indeed, he'd leave me in no doubt as to which the day he and I found ourselves alone together in the hotel lift. His swiftness of movement matching his audacity, the bigger and stronger man suddenly grabbed me and pulled me towards him. Locked in his arms, Manuel slid his tongue in my mouth and began kissing me. Upon reaching the ground floor, and with the intention of prolonging the moment, he sent the lift up to the top floor and back down again. Like a child feasting on their favorite lolly, Manuel circled around my lips with his tongue. Only the intermittent tickling sensation of his moustache on my mouth would interrupt the feeling of intense ecstasy I'd experienced in that moment. Yet the intensity of our initial encounter represented the high point of our brief interaction. What began with kissing soon progressed to me pleasuring Manuel orally. Having naturally developed into a horny teenager, I wanted to experience being pleasured in my turn. However, my pleasuring of him in that way would not be reciprocated. Nevertheless, as a naive and inexperienced lad, I hadn't realized I was being exploited by a man almost 3 times my age and mistook his lust as love. Predictably, my mother would provide no such guidance on the matter when I revealed all to her a few weeks later, and, in fact, would attempt to leverage my disclosure to her advantage. Although I hadn't intended to reveal the details of my relationship with Manuel to my mother, she rather forced my hand. Having returned to room 407 from work earlier than expected, she announced that, as a result of a conspiracy against her by work colleagues, she had been sacked. Knowing my mother to be incapable of telling the truth about anything, particularly when it involved any wrongdoing on her part, I knew I couldn't rely on her to be honest. Yet, following her announcement that with money all but run out, we could no longer remain in Malta and would have to return home, I broke down. In desperation, I revealed the details of my relationship with Manuel to my mother, along with my belief in my love for him. Sensing an opportunity, rather than caution me as to the dangers of exploitation, my mother suggested that if Manuel felt the same way about me, I should ask him for money so we could stay in Malta. Needless to say, as much as I didn't want to leave, I had no intention of asking Manuel for money. Despite having returned to canvassing, with very few short-stay tourists coming to Malta during the winter months, I was not making the kind of money that I had during the summer. Furthermore, although I'd subsequently take a second job pot washing in the hotel kitchen of an evening while Dee canvassed with me on the streets, it would not be enough to cover food and rent. Consequently, one evening in late February, Dee, Mum and I checked out of room 407 with nowhere to go. With our worldly possessions in a few bags around our feet, we sat in the hotel lobby and exchanged forlorn glances while privately hoping for an angel of mercy. Just then, Hillary walked in.
As was so typical of her, having spotted Hilary, my mother turned to Dee and asked her to approach him for help. While Dee refused, I had no such reservations, and so I accosted Hilary before explaining our predicament to him. Following my plea for help, Hilary conceded that he could not provide us with accommodation. With my hopes dashed, I rejoined Mum and Dee to break the news to them. Having taken a moment to speak to his friend David, the night receptionist, Hilary then came over to where we sat. In a somewhat hushed tone, he explained that David had given him a key to a room behind the pool bar where we could sleep for a few hours. After midnight, once the coast was clear, Hilary led us to the room behind the pool bar and ushered us inside. To the sight of bed frames stacked several high, it became immediately apparent that the room was being used for storage. On the 2 beds containing mattresses, Dee, Mum and I bedded down. In an attempt to keep the chill of the cold February night at bay, we remained in our clothes and huddled together. Before departing, Hilary explained that if we were discovered, David would lose his job. Stating his intention to return at 5 a.m, he then left so we could go to sleep. As we lay together in the dark, my mind wandered back to the moment a few weeks before, when Dee approached me with a scrunched-up £5 note in her hand. With there being only 2 single beds in room 407, Mum had spent each night alternating between my bed and Dee's. As that night was Dee's turn to have Mum, she attempted to bribe me with the £5 into having Mum with me in my bed for an additional night. As arranged, Hilary returned at 5 a.m. and, with his Beetle parked outside, spirited us out of the hotel via the rear entrance. In order to kill some time, Hilary drove us around the far north of the island. While slumped against each other on the back seat, Dee and Mum slept while Hilary and I talked and smoked. Shortly after, Hilary took us to his family home, where Dee and Mum continued to sleep while he and I went to a bar where we played pool and drank coffee. Later that day, my mother made an interesting discovery which would provide us with a temporary reprieve. This chance occurrence came about courtesy of the timeshare she'd bought a few months before. Crucially, her purchase of 1 week in the low season covering February and March enabled us to spend 1 week in a timeshare suite on the hotel's 6th floor. Consequently, in the space of 24 hours, we went from bedding down in secrecy in a cold storeroom to a plush 2-bedroom apartment with panoramic views over Bourguiba. Our reprieve allowed us vital breathing space to decide where to go next. While time was running out for my mother, she showed she wasn't ready to throw in the towel and return to the UK just yet. In contrast to our plush surroundings, we had very little money for food and even less for new items of clothing. While my mother began borrowing skirts with elasticated waistbands from Louise that she'd eventually return all stretched out, Dee inherited my cast-offs. Among them was a pair of jeans that, owing to a broken zip, were no longer wearable. Although I couldn't risk wearing jeans with the zip broken, Dee didn't seem to mind, despite the fact that through the gap it created, you could clearly see her knickers. As for our food, with regular meals in the pool bar a distant memory, we hit the local mini-market where we stocked up on pasta, instant coffee, and tins of evaporated milk, which left very little money for other essentials, such as soap and shampoo. Delaying the inevitable for a little longer yet, after leaving the timeshare apartment, we found ourselves completely reliant on the good graces of others. For the 2 weeks that followed, we stayed in a poorly heated apartment belonging to the parents of a friend of Claire and Louise. With no other offers of help forthcoming, my mother had to resort to drastic measures. 2 mysteries arose from these measures. The first was how she acquired the rental on a small flat opposite the rear entrance to the hotel. The second related to where she met the man she subsequently moved in to share it with us. With Dee and I still canvassing for the hotel timeshare during the day, and me pot washing in the hotel kitchen at night, the location was convenient. Yet, far less convenient was the presence of the latest man in my mother's life. In order to avoid confusion, I shall refer to the man as Rudy. While not his real name, Rudy shares the same name of an individual in this story with whom Dee and I would cross paths towards the end of 1987. As previously noted, where my mother met Rudy, I really could not say. With his tanned and leathery skin, curly grey hair pulled tightly to the back of his head, and shirt open to the navel, he had the dishevelled appearance of a street drinker. A far cry from the sophistication of my mother's previous lover, Steve, this man did not possess the look of someone with whom my mother would typically associate. However, when I came home from work every afternoon to find him cooking for Mum and Dee, I realised the nature of his appeal. While my mother got what she wanted, she ensured Rudy did too when he began staying over on a nightly basis. Although I had nothing against Rudy as a person, his continued presence and the nature of my mother's relationship with him bothered me, and so we began to quarrel. Our arguments becoming more and more heated, things came to a head one evening when my mother came at me with a steak knife she had stolen from the Pool Bar restaurant. Brandishing the knife in my face, I took hold on the serrated edge and snapped it off at the base. With my mother by now more furious than before, she lunged at me with the knife handle, to which I pushed her away. At this, my mother spun round and fell backwards, although not before hitting her head against a concrete pillar. To the sound of my mother crying out and the sight of blood coming from a cut above her eyebrow, Dee suddenly appeared. For what must have looked to her like a deliberate attack on my mother, and not an act of self-defence, Dee began to berate me before running off to fetch our friend Claire, who lived across the street. Little did I know then that my mother would use this bruising encounter to her advantage in a letter which I took back to the UK at the end of April. Throwing herself on my father's mercy, she told him how she wanted to come home and how in my company she feared for her safety as well as her sanity. Conveniently, she neglected to mention her relationship with Rudy and the other men she'd entertained in various beds over the past 6 months. Crucially, after having received letters from my mother during this time, in particular the one I gave him following my April visit, my father then wrote to his daughter Lee. In letters shown to me by Lee many years later, my father expressed considerable doubt to his daughter about having my mother back after all the trouble she'd caused him. In addition, and unbeknown to me at the time, my mother had disclosed to my father my relationship with Manuel. In turn, while expressing to Lee his amazement that I'd found love with another man, he asked himself whether he should be so surprised after all. Nonetheless, with my latest 3-month stay now at an end, I left Malta in the last week of April for a short stay with my father and Sass. When my father met me at Gatwick Airport, 2 things struck me. The first was how much weight he had lost as an already slender man, while the other was his uncharacteristic warmth towards me. However, I wouldn't have to wait too long to discover his motivation when, on the way home, he asked if I had any money. When I replied that I had a little to spare, he asked if I could lend it to him until he could draw the family allowance and pay me back. While I had no regard for my father, it brought me no gratification to see him so broken. As to his malnourished appearance, he disclosed having recently had a dodgy meat pie from a street van, following which he suffered food poisoning. Having arrived in Maidstone, I found my father and sister sharing a Victorian terraced house on a main road just outside the town. While Dad and Sass had a room on the first floor, the ground floor was occupied by a couple in their late 20s and their 2 young girls. Although I wouldn't go so far as to say my father and I got on like a house on fire, it seemed strange to enjoy uncharacteristically cordial relations with him. Yet our bonhomie would not last once word had reached us from Malta that my mother had decided to come home. Following her request of him to purchase her a one-way ticket, my father and I went into Maidstone and got a good deal on a flight. Predictably, betraying none of the doubt that he'd expressed in his letters to Lee, my father welcomed my mother back with open arms. Days before my own return to Malta, my father and I were back at Gatwick Airport to fetch my mother. Despite her pleas to him and the current wretched state of her life, she appeared in no way gratified to be back in the UK. Her displeasure would be on full display upon discovering she'd be sharing accommodation with another family. That night, with Sass and me on bunk beds and my father on a divan, my mother sat on the edge of the bed and refused to get undressed. Having fallen asleep to her protestations, I awoke a few hours later to observe my mother still sitting bolt upright and fully clothed in the dark. Come the morning, I awoke to the sight of her dress on the floor and the owner fast asleep on the edge of the bed. With my mother now back in the fold and me about to return to Malta, my father was only too happy to schlep out to Gatwick Airport once again. Heading back to Malta as a 14-year-old, for the first time I faced the prospect of life without my parents. Yet, with my mother now back in England, I hadn't given any thought to where Dee and I would stay. At Malta Airport, I'd be met by Hilary, who revealed that Dee was now sharing a room in a flat alongside a new cohort of timeshare canvassers. With the implication being that there was no room for me, Hilary offered me the single bed next to him in his parents' house until I could make other arrangements. Unexpectedly, the intervention of fate would give me no such opportunity to make other arrangements, and instead, within 2 weeks of my return to Malta, I'd find myself back in the UK once more. The incident which brought events to a head occurred one afternoon in the second week of June. While out canvassing on the Strand in Bourguiba, I wandered into a gift shop to buy a cold drink. Behind the counter sat the shopkeeper, a bespectacled lady I'd never seen before. As I approached the counter to pay for my drink, the lady inquired as to the whereabouts of my mother. Somewhat taken aback by the question, I responded that she was no longer in Malta. With no idea how this woman knew my mother, or me, I asked why she wanted to know. In reply, the woman revealed herself to be the landlady of the apartment we'd stayed in along with Rudy. To my surprise, the woman went on to explain that my mother had never paid the rent. Furthermore, she alleged my mother told her that owing to a bereavement, she had to go back to the UK and would reimburse her as soon as possible. In the absence of my mother, she demanded payment from either me or my sister. In no position to repay the debt, suddenly I felt the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. Demanding to know where Dee was living now, under pressure and in a moment of panic, I informed the woman of Dee's whereabouts. With the landlady having subsequently tracked her down, understandably, Dee was furious with me. Later on that day, she and I entered into a blazing row in the hotel kitchen. While in the throes of confrontation, Hilary entered the room. Upon seeing Dee and I begin squaring up to each other, in a preemptive strike, Hilary intervened and proceeded to punch me in the face. No sooner had he done so than I fled in tears to Claire's flat around the corner from the hotel. Although unable to see things more rationally at the time, I'd found myself in a situation I was far too immature to manage appropriately. Furthermore, I'd make matters worse by leaving Malta without considering the longer-term consequences of having to live once more with my parents. Nonetheless, I couldn't see beyond my momentary anger and left Malta the next day vowing I never wanted to see my sister again. Following my return to the UK, the summer of 1987 represented the first time I'd fall into what I'd later recognise as a bout of depression. Coupled with life under my parents' roof, contributing to my low mood was another failed attempt to return to school. Having witnessed me withdrawing ever further into myself, my father, in a rare display of concern for me, took me to the local courts for a game of tennis. With Dad at the net, I fired ground strokes at him, which he blocked back with crisp volleys. When one forehand I hit went whistling past him, for the only time in my life, he complimented me for having hit a good shot. However, tennis alone would not be enough to lift me out of the funk. What made matters worse was that, with my anger having abated, I began to miss Dee and realised the mistake I'd made in leaving Malta so abruptly. Realising the depth of my misery and the fact that as long as I was around, he wouldn't be the sole focus of my mother's attention, Dad phoned Dee and told her of his intention to send me back to her. Following Dee's acceptance on 31st of August, I returned to Malta. Our falling out swiftly forgotten, the sight of Hilary waiting for me in the airport arrivals lounge could not have been more pleasing. Likewise with Dee, who, sporting a deep tan and yellow espadrilles, met me outside the hotel kitchen during her break. With minimal effort, I soon settled back into my canvassing role, while Dee and I worked alternate nights in the kitchen. Although Dee explained that I'd be staying with her, as all the beds were taken up, I'd have to sleep on the lounge settee. Located in a coastal town next to Bourguiba, our second-floor apartment overlooked the sea and some salt pans. Despite the stench of sulphur, the discomfort of the settee's wooden frame digging into my ribs, and the sound of mosquitoes buzzing overhead, I slept contentedly each night. Following the move 6 weeks later of Dee's roommate, I began sleeping in the single bed in Dee's room while she slept in a double. While throughout September I'd earn a reasonable amount of money from canvassing, come the end of the month, the tourist trade began to die off. Had I learned the lessons from our struggle earlier on in the year, I would have been more conservative with my spending in preparation for the winter. Yet, Dee and I were living among a group of 20-something Brits content to spend their evenings in the bar across the street from our apartment. Consequently, from time to time, we found ourselves smoking and drinking alongside them. Unable to build up much of a tolerance to alcohol, I'd often end up being sick before reaching our apartment. On another occasion, in the not-too-distant future, I'd overdo it once again, although this time with disastrous consequences. Before then, on Wednesday 14th of October, I telephoned my parents to let them know I'd be coming home on the Saturday of that week. During our conversation, my mother expressed her surprise that my voice had broken. Without much thought up until that point for the lot of my parents, on Saturday 17th of October, I flew back to the UK for an 8-day trip. While glancing out of the window as my plane approached Gatwick, the sight of flattened trees and power lines met my eyes. Not until we were heading home did I learn of the full extent of the hurricane which had occurred 2 days earlier. With the exception of a few roof tiles landing around the back of his car, Dad explained that the house had escaped undamaged. However, upon arriving home, I looked across the street and witnessed the sight of an enormous tree which had fallen into the block of flats opposite. An additional surprise came with the news that, following the departure of the couple living downstairs, Mum and Dad had moved to the lower floor to make way for a lodger. Furthermore, this lodger was none other than Angela, Dee's fearsome friend from Cornwallis. While appearing more cheerful than usual, my father did most of the talking while my mother sat in silence. This was not the usual way of things and led me to wonder what on earth was going on. Having not seen Angela since our last day at school the year before, I found myself excited to see her again. With her flame-red hair as big and vampish as ever, I couldn't wait to sit down and bring her up to speed with events abroad. As it happened, neither could she, and before long she asked me to intervene in a situation involving my parents. My curiosity sufficiently roused, I listened intently as Angela explained that my father had been having an affair. Dismissing the notion out of hand, I revealed the full extent of my mother's infidelity towards my father and declared him incapable of doing the same. To this, Angela responded that during the past few weeks, he'd been going to the house next door but one and spending a few hours of an evening with the lady living there. In reply, I stated this was not proof of his infidelity. While Angela conceded my point, she revealed having been woken up at night to the sound of my mother pleading with my father to confirm whether he was having an affair. Sensitive to my mother's anguish, Angela asked me to speak to him. Considering her behavior over the years, I had no sympathy for my mother whatsoever and, on that basis, declined to intervene. Nonetheless, what this occurrence did go to show was that while my mother didn't want my father, she didn't want anyone else to have him. Following her disclosure about my father's supposed infidelity, Angela proceeded to lament the lack of fulfillment in her life. Citing a succession of unsatisfying sexual encounters and her dead-end job as a sales assistant in a wickerware shop, she rued her current prospects and wanted more. Whether Angela had been sending out subliminal messages that my mother had somehow picked up on, I had no idea. However, I'm at a loss to account for her proposal on the day prior to us going to London to purchase my return ticket to Malta that I take Angela with me. Suggesting that Angela could keep Dee company when my mother offered to pay for her ticket, of course 17-year-old Angela jumped at the chance. Therefore, with Dee unaware that I would not be travelling alone, on Sunday 25th October, Angela and I headed to Malta, where Dee and Hilary awaited my arrival. Having arrived late in the evening, Angela and I made our way through the airport to the arrivals lounge. Maximizing the element of surprise, while I headed towards Dee and Hilary, Angela crouched behind me. Upon reaching them, Angela popped up and gave Dee a huge hug. Catching a glimpse of Dee's face, I perceived a mix of shock and surprise in her expression. Sometime later, Dee would confide in me that while she had been pleased to see her friend, she knew Angela to be a force of nature and someone whom trouble seemed to follow around. Indeed, time would prove Dee's fears to be founded, and no more than a month had passed before an incident occurred following which we'd find ourselves homeless once again. Wasting little time in creating an impression, the shenanigans of our new flatmate began on her very first day. Actually, they began before that, as became evident when Dee, Angela and I sat together in the lounge the morning following our arrival. While we were sat talking, Angela suddenly got up and went to the bedroom. Returning momentarily, Angela laid out on the lounge coffee table some cigarette papers, some rolling tobacco, and a small ball wrapped in cellophane. Having laid out the papers upon which she sprinkled some tobacco, Angela then unwrapped the ball to reveal some dark brown matter resembling chocolate. After taking her lighter to it, she began crumbling the substance over the tobacco as if it were an OXO cube. While Dee and I looked on in astonishment, it became clear that Angela had put us both at risk by smuggling what I later learned to be hashish into Malta. With it being essential that Angela attempt to earn her own money, the next day she accompanied Dee and me to the complex. There, we talked the canvassing manager, Minnie, into giving Angela a job as a canvasser. In addition, on account of her bubbly personality and sex appeal, the catering manager snapped Angela up immediately and gave her a job behind the bar. Yet, the force of nature Dee had spoken of would soon emerge, and before long, Angela began hanging out with some wayward boy racer types and turning up for work whenever she felt like it. Things came to a head one Saturday night when she and I planned to have dinner in the hotel pool bar. Having sat down at the very table where my mother and I had had our humiliating confrontation just over a year before, Angela and I began swilling pints of dry cider. Although she and I had gone out with the intention of having dinner, on account of the amount of cider I had drunk, I no longer felt hungry. When Angela's spaghetti bolognese arrived, the 2 small forkfuls I ate confirmed that I definitely lost my appetite. No sooner had she finished her meal than she and I headed upstairs with the intention of dropping into the kitchen to say hello to Dee before going on to a club. Alas, we wouldn't even make it as far as the kitchen before Angela stopped to talk to a young guy. Possessing an innate ability to attract bad boys, before I knew what was happening, the 3 of us were holed up in a cubicle in the men's toilets where Angela produced a joint. While she and the guy passed it backwards and forwards, between them, at regular intervals, one of them would place it between my lips before telling me to breathe in. Taking small drags, before long I began to feel dizzy and lost some of the feeling in my feet. In need of fresh air, I stumbled through the hotel reception and made it outside where I sat on a wall for a few minutes. Just then, a peculiar sensation came over me, following which I immediately burst out laughing. Having remained in this state for what seemed like an age, I struggled to my feet before tottering off towards the outside entrance to the hotel kitchen in search of Dee. Considering the prospect of surprising her absolutely hilarious, I grabbed a window shutter and thrust it open. To the sight of a startled Dee turning around from the kitchen sink to see what the noise was, I burst into laughter once again before slamming the shutter closed. From there, I made my way back up to the hotel's front entrance. Suddenly, I found myself joined by the guy from the toilets, minus Angela. Too disorientated to bother looking for her, I asked him if he wanted to go to a club. Thinking we'd need more money, we both stumbled back to my apartment. There, in a moment of disorientation and utter thoughtlessness, I took my pay packet from a drawer and gave him the entire contents. Promising to meet him in a club later on, I told the guy I just needed to have a little sleep beforehand. To the sound of distant banging, I gradually awoke in the dark. Stumbling over to turn on the light, I felt something warm and sticky on my cheek. After turning on the light, I looked over towards my bed and saw what looked like an entire bowl of spaghetti bolognese all over my bed and up the curtains. With the sound of further banging, I realized there was someone at the door and went to open it. There, looking exhausted and suitably pissed off, was Dee. Leading her down the corridor to our bedroom and apologizing profusely along the way, the last thing my sister wanted to have to deal with was a pile of vomit. Indeed, I'd leave it until the next day to explain to her that I'd given all my money away to a complete stranger, to which she deservedly gave it to me both barrels for my stupidity.
Hot on the heels of the cannabis incident, from which we'd both barely recovered, came the straw that broke the camel's back. Taking advantage of a warm November day, Dee, Angela and I decided to sit out on the apartment balcony. Just then, Angela got up and went over to the railings. No sooner had she done so than a car roared past, to which she whooped and waved. To the sound of the car coming to a screeching halt, Dee and I immediately got up and went over to the railings. Down on the street below us, in a flashy convertible, were two boy racer types. With this, Dee and I returned to our chairs, just in time to witness Angela pull up her t-shirt and expose her bare breasts. Curious to see their reaction, Dee and I went back to the railings to observe both men standing on their seats. With their pants pulled down to their knees, both men jiggled their penises before roaring off into the distance. Alas, what we considered to be nothing more than high jinks would turn out to have dire consequences. Unbeknown to us, on the day this incident occurred, our elderly landlords were sitting out on the balcony in the apartment directly below. Having become alerted by Angela whooping and the screeching tires, they too looked over their railings to observe the young men exposing themselves. Suitably outraged, we, along with the other tenants, were given immediate notice to quit. While Angela threw her lot in with one of the boy racers she'd been hanging out with, Dee and I were left once again having to rely on the good graces of others. The first person to come to our rescue would be our friend Claire. Despite strict instructions from her father that no males were allowed in their apartment, following my explanation of our predicament, Claire allowed us to stay with her for the next 2 weeks. With Dee and I still quite small for our age, we're able to sleep comfortably in a single bed beside Claire. Following this, we found ourselves once again sharing a single bed, although this time on the upstairs landing of a converted garage. Similarly temporary, our accommodation belonged to a short and overweight man by the name of Reno, a van driver for one of the other timeshare resorts in St. Paul's Bay. Despite his kindness towards us, Reno seemed a rather mysterious figure about whom something just didn't feel quite right. Yet, with the odd hours he kept, and the fact that he'd often stay out all night, there were periods when we saw very little of him. Consequently, with Dee having just turned 17, and me, 2 days before Christmas, turning 15, she and I enjoyed our first Christmas without either of our parents. Providing a real feast, she and I munched on steak burgers and chips while playing our favourite cassette tapes.
When it came to having a bath, Dee and I resorted to boiling pots of water on the stovetop. Owing to the number of pots required to fill the bath, we took to sharing each other's water. Furthermore, with there being no central heating in the garage, Dee and I kept warm courtesy of an old floor heater and the electric blanket on our bed. However, having shifted around in the bed one night, Dee had dislodged the sheet on her side and had been sleeping directly on the electric blanket. Being old and worn out, the copper wires had become exposed, as a result of which Dee awoke the following morning to discover superficial burns down one side of her body. While Christmas of 1987 may have passed unremarkably, New Year's Eve would provide the highlight of the festive season. With the hotel restaurant fully booked, both Dee and I were tasked to work. Having washed enough pots, pans and dishes to sink a battleship, we joined the chefs sat on one side of the kitchen for a beer and a well-earned smoke. Next to them on the countertop sat trays of leftover cake. In a moment of playfulness, one of the young chefs scooped up a handful of cake and threw it in the face of the eldest chef, who was too slow to move out of the way. Just then, all hell broke loose, and with us all joining in, the air quickly became thick with cake flying in all directions across the kitchen. Not even a bollocking from the catering manager would blunt our spirits, as Dee and I ushered in 1988 on our hands and knees, scraping cake up off the kitchen floor. Alas, the new year would not signal a positive change in our fortunes, and the beginning of January would see Dee and I leave Reno's garage suddenly.
Our departure came courtesy of a comment made to me on the Strand by a canvasser working for the hotel for which Reno drove a van. During our conversation, the canvasser asked me if I was aware of where Reno spent his nights. When I responded that I had no idea, they revealed that Reno acted as a pimp for the working girls of Straight Street, the center of Valletta's notorious red light district. Whether or not a preposterous slander, Dee and I felt sufficiently unsettled by the prospect, following which I resolved to find us somewhere else to live. As luck would have it, an opportunity arose for us to share with two British men, also from Kent, who'd recently arrived from the UK to canvass for our hotel. Both in their mid-20s by that time, Marcus and Eddie had secured a short-term rental on a third-floor apartment along the street from my friend Connie's family restaurant of Swiss Chalet. Initially, Marcus and Eddie shared with an older female canvasser. However, when it came to light that she had pilfered an alarm clock from Marcus and Eddie's room, then concealed it in her bed, Eddie gave the woman her marching orders. With Eddie having invited us to move in, I arrived the following evening with our possessions. Following Marcus's move into the main bedroom, Eddie explained that Dee and I would have to share a bed, or beds, with him. In fact, his bed consisted of 2 single beds pushed together. Therefore, we agreed that he and I would sleep on the outside, while Dee would take the middle. On to the matter of rent, my body temperature began to rise and my heart rate quicken. With Dee and I making barely enough money for food, I knew that rent on top of having to save for our next trip home would prove to be a struggle. When Eddie explained that we'd need to contribute to the deposit, which meant he'd need 40 Maltese pounds up front, I began to panic. Making the excuse that I had to leave to go and fetch the money, I left our possessions on the floor of Eddie's room and fled. Having reached the bottom of the stairs, I stood outside on the street, not knowing what the hell to do. Just then, I turned and saw the lights of Swiss Chalet glinting like a beacon of hope in the distance, so I headed towards the restaurant in search of Connie. To my eternal relief, I found Connie where she spent most of her time as a teenager, working behind the bar. Adding to my relief, when I revealed our plight, Connie was only too happy to lend me the money we needed. Indeed, this would not be the only time Connie came to our aid. In order to afford the rent, we had very little money left over for food. Consequently, we found ourselves some nights going to bed early to sleep through our hunger, while on other occasions I approached Connie once more. Ever kind and generous, she'd load me up with pizza and bottles of beer to take back to the apartment to share with Dee, Eddie and Marcus. Furthermore, the nights when Dee or I worked in the kitchen provided us with an additional opportunity to scrounge some food. Our stay with Eddie and Marcus would not be complete without some bedroom mishap for my unfortunate sibling. This time, it wasn't another encounter with a worn-out electric blanket which would be the cause of Dee's latest strife. No, going to bed each night, Dee would assume her designated place in the middle. However, on account of all the tossing and turning, the 2 single beds would separate during the night. Consequently, I'd wake up on many a morning to the sight of my sister with her bum on the floor and her feet inches away from her face in a perfect V shape. While Eddie and I saw the funny side of it, Dee didn't so much. Come March 1988, my sister and I had remained in Malta without our parents for almost 7 months and had no contact with them since the previous December. With my latest 3-month stay about to expire, I ventured home unaware that within a month I'd be back in the UK permanently. The circumstances which brought about my departure occurred during my latest trip back home. While in a shopping centre in Maidstone 2 days before my return flight, Mum and I bumped into the estranged wife of one of the hotel's timeshare managers. Upon learning that I still lived in Malta, the woman asked after her estranged husband. When I explained that he and his new girlfriend appeared to be getting on very well, the woman made her excuses and hurried off. Not until I returned to Malta 2 days later would I find out that with this throwaway comment, my fate had been sealed. With Dee unaware of my return date, upon answering the door of the apartment, she scolded me for not letting her know I was coming back. Furthermore, she explained that had I done so, she would have told me not to bother. When I asked why, Dee explained that following my conversation in Maidstone with the estranged wife of the timeshare manager, she had phoned him to let him know she knew of the existence of a new girlfriend. Upon learning it was me who told her, the manager summoned Dee and advised her to tell me I was sacked and no longer welcome in the hotel. Furthermore, should I cross his path, the manager advised Dee that he'd probably punch me. At a loss to understand exactly what I'd done, and despite the warning, I went to the hotel later that day to speak to the manager. During a rather heated conversation, he stated that with my comment I had made things difficult for him when the time came to divorce his wife. Still none the wiser for his anger towards me, what I did know deep down was that without my job, maybe the time had finally come for me to leave Malta and return to the UK. Unlike my mother, I accepted my fate and saw no reason to delay the inevitable. To some, over the past 2 years, I'd been a good friend and someone who made them laugh, while to others, I was cocky, immature, and a pain in the arse. Nonetheless, I left Malta at the end of April 1988 and returned briefly for a week at the end of June. With Claire, 18 years old by this time, and allowed to entertain males in her apartment, I stayed with her and Louise. With the help of Connie, I enjoyed our time together to do all the touristy things that being a resident I never found time to do. Yet one unfortunate incident which occurred during my stay I prayed would be forgotten the next time I visited in June 1991. Having completely abandoned my sense of self-restraint, one afternoon while sunbathing on the roof of Claire's apartment, I forgot myself and indulged an urge to masturbate. Concealing myself behind a wall, I sat down and began doing the deed. However, just as I was about to climax, Louise appeared. Realizing she'd discovered me in an act of self-pleasure, she immediately turned around and walked away before calling my name. Suitably humiliated, I stood up from behind the wall and returned to the apartment, praying that Louise wouldn't mention the unfortunate incident to Claire. To my relief, no mention of it has been made, until now, of course. Suffice to say that despite the trials and tribulations of the past year, the 8 months Dee and I remained in Malta without our parents constituted the quietest period of my life thus far. Yet one event which occurred following my fallout with Dee and return to the UK stands out from all the others that year. While driving towards Maidstone with my father, with never much to say to each other, we headed into town in silence. All of a sudden, my father turned to me before blurting out how glad he was that I didn't turn out to be gay. Despite the frankness of his comment, I didn't care enough for my father to tell him the truth. Furthermore, I found myself more than a little surprised that he gave a damn whether I was or not.
Nevertheless, while I settled back into life in the UK, Dee too would return home for good 3 months later. However, Dee would not be alone for long. Indeed, within a few weeks of her arrival, her boyfriend, a Maltese man by the name of Joe, came to live with us. Our current home far too small to house 6 people, shortly before Dee and Joe's nuptials in September, we moved into a 3-bedroomed house in the South Maidstone village of Bourton-Monchelsea. With patterns of behaviour so well established, hot on the heels of the quietest period of my life came the next chaotic instalment. Indeed, this latest episode would culminate in my removal from the family home, followed by a sudden and shocking event that nobody appeared to see coming.
What the hell was I thinking? No guiding light from above. Had to find out the hard way that it really wasn't love. With the one who brought me here, I lay my feelings bare. I know she doesn't give a shit, so no surprises there. More freedom than I can handle. Can't keep my feet on the ground. I guess in time I'll work it out. Some things are lost and some are found. back and forth I go, act like nothing's wrong. In truth, I'm just a frightened kid seeking somewhere to belong. Blowing back with Angela, how foolish can I be? First drunk and stoned, then potless. Is this really the life for me? More freedom than I can handle. Can't keep my feet on the ground. I guess in time I'll work it out. Some things are lost and some are found. From ignorance to experience, I've learned my lessons well, of life and truth and happiness. Some thrilling tales to tell. The greatest lesson I could learn to feel comfortable in my skin is that happiness doesn't lie elsewhere. Instead it lies within. More freedom than I can handle. Can't keep my feet on the ground. I guess in time I'll work it out. Some things are lost and some are found. More freedom than I can handle. Can't keep my feet on the ground. I guess in time I'll work it out. Some things are lost and some are found. I guess in time I'll work it out. Some things are lost and some are found.